Personally, I love to perform, but you may not feel the same way about that. That's okay. I think regardless of your personal feelings about performing at the piano, it is very important that we do train our students to perform well and have performance skills. Because frankly, music is for sharing. Music is for sharing our human feelings.
Hey there, it's Tim, and I'm so excited to let you know that if you're teaching guitar or want to break into offering guitar lessons as part of your business, then you're going to want to check out our brand new show. It launched this month. It's called the Top Music Guitar Podcast, hosted by Michael Gumley. It airs Friday on all podcast platforms, including Spotify, each week. You'll get insider advice on how the best guitar studios get built and how to teach guitar lessons that students keep coming back for. Don't miss out. Go and check it out. It's free and downloadable right now. Hello, amazing teachers of the world. It's Tim Topham, and you're listening to the Topcast. It's great to be spending another little bit of time with you today. I hope you've had a great Easter break if you've celebrated it last weekend. And actually, some of you might even be celebrating Easter this weekend if you're perhaps part of the Greek community. So either way, I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of time off during this little period. School holidays here in Australia, actually, which is quite nice. So it's been great to get some time with the kids and some time away from teaching and work. So I hope you've been able to do the same thing. Today's episode is a little bit different, actually. We're going to be taking a sneak peek inside one of our many amazing workshops that are available to our members. If you've not been a classical concert performer, you may be a little bit out of your depth when it comes to how periods of music should sound, how that trill should be played, what note it should start on, should phrases kind of taper in this particular era, how should the detached left notes be played in Baroque music or Baroque music, what makes Baroque music different to classical, and what is different about classical to how you play romantic, and what about the different styles of scherzo and waltz and all of these kinds of things. There are so many questions that all of us have, and oftentimes the only way I've been able to solve this question is to actually email or ring a more experienced teacher if I've got a question that is really important for someone going for a high-level exam, for example. How should this be played stylistically in an appropriate way for the period of music? So today's workshop is all about unpacking that very topic with our historical repertoire expert inside our membership, the amazing Janna Williamson. I'm going to introduce you to her in just a moment. But before that, a couple of quick reminders. Did you know that each week our Top Music Pro members can join one of 3 co-working power hours, we call them, as part of their membership? Held in 3 different time zones, members get together for 1 hour of working on whatever project that they want to work on. I've been joining the Aussie group at 11 a.m. on Thursdays and mainly using that time to practice. And it's so great just working alongside other teachers. Even though you're doing your own thing and you're in your own house, it really helps to keep you accountable. So at the start of the session, we just check in and everyone says what they're going to be working on for the hour. And then at the end of the hour, super quick check-in. All right, how do we go? Did you get everything done? And just keeping you in your lane. I liken it a little bit to going bowling and putting the bumpers up. Just helps. You've got a limited runway, you've got 1 hour, and you've got something to do and you need to get it done in that amount of time. And it's just great knowing that there are other people working hard at whatever they're doing at the same time. That's just one of the many benefits of joining Top Music Pro, and they are completely free and run 3 times a week in various time zones. Now, for those of you who aren't members but are teaching in Australia, if you ever teach diploma level students, make sure you check out my diploma teaching guides, which are available over on the marketplace, which will really help you with the general knowledge component of the exam. It's one of those parts that are often kind of left till the last minute, sadly. You can download composer-specific information packs based around some key pieces, or grab the entire bundle. It comes with all the kinds of questions that your students will be asked by the examiners and what they need to focus on. You can just search for AMUSA over at topmusicmarketplace.com if you'd like. And you can also read an article about my 8 steps to diploma or performance diploma success and my experience of taking a diploma as an adult teacher. You can check that out over on the blog at topmusic.co/AMUSA. So that's topmusic.co/AMUSA. All right, let's get on with the show. Firstly, let me introduce you to Janna Williamson. She's a highly sought-after teacher of students of all levels with 2 decades of professional teaching experience. She maintains a home studio in West Chicago and taught at the Wheaton Yamaha Music School from 2001 to 2020. She's been an MTNA Nationally Certified Teacher of Music since 2004 and holds bachelor's and master's degrees in piano performance. Janna enjoys playing solo and collaboratively and can be heard throughout the Chicago area on a regular basis. And here's what a couple of our members said about the workshop that I'm about to introduce you to. May Poe said, "Thanks for putting this together, Janna. Really useful, and I particularly enjoyed the art and architectural associations and the historical context given for each period. I remember learning a lot of this when I was a kid doing my musicianship exams, but it was so dry and I forgot a lot of it, to be honest. This was a really good refresher." And from Vanessa, who said, "This was awesome. I studied music history at uni and loved this so much. A great reminder for me to include the historical reference more." So you're in for an absolute treat today as we share this workshop with you. And some of the things that we'll be covering in this is how to teach these historical time periods, why does expressive performance matter, and then looking at Baroque, classical, romantic, impressionist, and 20th and 21st century repertoire, and talking about generally what makes a performance expressive. Now, right at the start of this recording, Janna mentions her piece by piece series. So just to give you a little bit of context, our members each month get to enjoy 2 videos that Janna creates for us showing how to teach all of these kinds of things in historical intermediate repertoire. It's an incredible series and we've built an amazing library already so that if you ever need to teach a particular style or piece of music, you can just go and search for it inside our academy and be able to watch an incredibly experienced teacher teaching it, show you the tricks, and you can even download a 1 to 2 page summary of the main teaching points. It's incredibly valuable. It's one of the most cherished resources that our members have access to each month, and that's part of our Top Music Pro membership. So if you like what you've heard today and you enjoyed this session with Janna, then make sure you do explore coming and joining us inside the members area over at topmusicpro.com.
Hi, teachers. I hope you've been enjoying the piece by piece video series that I've been making for Top Music Pro. It's really fun to make those videos. I love doing a deep dive into individual pieces and thinking about how we can teach them in the best way, in the way that's most helpful for our students. But when I first talked with Tim about making that video series, I also talked with him about how we could make sure teachers had some more general overview resources, things that make you kind of step back and look at intermediate historical repertoire as a whole, or one particular time period as a whole, and not just approach this type of teaching with, one random piece here and one random piece there. So today, I'm hoping to give you a little bit more historical context and tools on how to teach these historical time periods. So my title for today's talk is Teaching Expression in Intermediate Historical Repertoire. However, I realize that's pretty much the most boring title I could have possibly come up with. So if you prefer, we could title this instead, Teaching Our Students to Play with All the Feels. This is one of my biggest passions in my teaching, is to make sure that my students are able to express themselves, to play beautifully or excitingly with lots of passion in whatever emotion they are trying to express. So that's what I'm hoping to help you with today. Whenever I start any kind of talk, I always want to make sure that I'm really clear on what my goal is. And so my vision for today's talk is that we want to lead our students to achieve expressive performance of their historical repertoire. I'm not going to cover jazz and popular styles today. However, I will just say that since the newer, more current styles are based on centuries of keyboard and piano playing, there are certainly going to be a few things here that are going to be applicable to all styles. And I encourage you to think creatively about taking whatever I'm able to offer here today into all styles that you are teaching. But we're going to specifically focus on those older historical styles. So this begs the question, why does expressive performance matter? Well, I think this is a good question to really dive into. Personally, I love to perform, but you may not feel the same way about that. That's okay. I think regardless of your personal feelings about performing at the piano, it is very important that we do train our students to perform well and have performance skills. Because frankly, music is for sharing. Music is for sharing our human feelings. What is art? Well, art is just any kind of expression of the human condition. And we are so benefited when we view or hear or experience beautiful or interesting artwork, right? I know that I have healing experiences when I hear some amazing work of musical art, or when I see something that's just visually really stimulating and beautiful. And that cathartic experience that we have when we experience art is what we want to train our students to be able to do. Even if the only performing that they ever do is for their mom or their dad or their other family members, we do need to train them in how to do this so that they are able to share their art with other people. Dots and lines on the page, in the book, that's not music. Music is the oral expression, the performance in time. That's what music is. And lastly, music is meant for our own personal benefit. Nothing feels better than when you're feeling stressed out or angry or whatever, and you sit down at the piano and you just play for a while and you work that out. And so when we help our students know how to do that, to have the facility to really, truly play expressively, then we are allowing them to solidify their identity as musicians, as pianists, as people who make art, as people who are able to express themselves. All right, so let's dive into how we are going to do that. The only prerequisite I'm going to give you today for achieving this vision is this. We have to assign appropriately leveled repertoire. If we offer our students pieces that are too hard for them, that either they don't have the technical skill to actually be able to execute, or they don't have the musical or cognitive skill to be able to understand, then we are frankly setting our students up for failure. Nothing is less motivating than not being able to do something. I've been there. I know I've tried playing pieces that, at least for a period of time, I can't play. And it's the most frustrating thing. So of course, teaching music is a two-way street. The teacher needs to be able to communicate, demonstrate, help a student, facilitate them in being able to do something, to handle something technically, or to be able to understand something musically. And the student has to practice. So we know that that's a two-way street. But the first step is to make sure that we are offering our students pieces that we know they can actually play. Now, if a student brings a piece to you, like the classic level 1 student who brings in the complete Fur-Elise and says, I want to play this, that's a different conversation and one that we can have in a different context. But I'm talking specifically about when we offer our students a new book or a new set of pieces to choose from, we need to make sure that it's in their level. If you're looking at a piece and you realize there's one element or one technical skill that they've never done before, fine. This piece can be a great vehicle for them learning how to do that. But if you're looking at a piece and you're seeing 2 or 3 or 4 things that they've never encountered before, that they don't understand or they don't know how to do, then I would say that piece is probably too hard for them. And you need to prepare with something easier, or even just an exercise that allows them to learn that skill and be prepared for that actual piece that you want them to work on. We've created a guide for evaluating the difficulty of a piece, and we'll make sure that that's linked here. And I would just encourage you to use that as you're choosing repertoire for your students, with then the things I'm going to talk about now in mind. So for most piano music or keyboard music, we have these 4 time periods. There is some keyboard music from the medieval times and the Renaissance, but it's such a small amount that I'm not going to cover it. And we're just going to start right with the Baroque period. And of course, these time frames are really general. And so it's not like somebody woke up on January 1st of 1750 and said, I think we're done with Baroque now. Let's move on to something different. Historians have gone back and given these categories, and of course there are subcategories here and all this, but I'm going to generally work in this time frame and separate out how we think about expression according to these time periods, because they do all have their individual characteristics, performance practice, ideas, all those kinds of things. So let's start with Baroque. I'm going to spend the most time here because this is the time period that is, of course, the most far removed from us just in terms of time, as well as cultural relevance and context. When you look at books of pieces for piano, you'll see these composers. Of course, J.S. Bach is probably the greatest example of our Baroque composers, and he wrote so much music for keyboard. Of course, we have Handel and Domenico Scarlatti and Telemann as well. But on the right side, I also have several of these minor masters that are included in a lot of our intermediate series. And I can't imagine where we'd be if we didn't have some of their pieces. Some of them are our students' favorites. So this is just a general overview of who we're talking about here. So let's talk about the characteristics in this time period. First and foremost, Baroque music is usually composed in a polyphonic texture. That just means more than one independent line. So the classic example of this would be the Bach inventions, where the right hand has its own part that is independently moving and very linear, and the left hand has its own part, which is independently moving and very linear. And neither hand is accompanying the other one or subservient to the other one. So what this means for our students is that they need to really understand each individual line. They need to hear each individual line as its own thing. They need to understand that both need to be played clearly and articulated clearly, and that one of them is not subservient to the other. I'll just throw out there that if you are trying to memorize Baroque music, it's very important that those lower lines, like the bass line or the alto line, if you're doing 3 parts like a sinfonia, it's very important that those parts are in your ear and that the student understands those parts just as well as the top part. There's not a right hand melody with a left hand accompaniment. Within those lines, we have melodic devices of repetition, which just means something repeated, exactly the same. Imitation, which is where one voice says something and another voice imitates it. That might be in an orchestra context. The flute might play a little motive and then the bassoon imitates it. At the piano, this is usually one hand or one voice in one hand plays this and then the other hand imitates it. And then sequence. Sequence is when you have a melodic motive, short piece of music that is then moved up or down onto the next pitch up, usually by steps, although sometimes they skip around. My favorite example to explain this to students with is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Da, 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 then becomes da, 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 da. That's a sequence. Starts on G, then it moves to F. So when your students are playing any of these melodic devices, they need to hear them and recognize them, and then they need to do something with them. If the left hand is imitating the right hand, he should really bring that out and kind of be a little bit more present than the right hand when he's starting that imitation. If you have sequenced material, that's a great opportunity to decide on some dynamics to maybe make each next sequenced pattern louder or softer. All these kinds of things. Baroque pieces should have a consistent mood throughout the movement. If you have a multi-movement work, such as a Bach French suite, each different movement has a different mood. But within each movement, it's one consistent mood. You might see the word affect in books about Baroque performance practice. That's just the word that they use to describe mood. And different pieces have different affects. Of course, things like joyful or melancholy or reflective. You can come up with all kinds of mood words, but whatever it is, from the very first note to the last note, it means to stay consistent. That also means that your tempo needs to stay consistent throughout the movement. There are a few exceptions to this. I think of pieces that have some improvisatory sections in the middle of them. There are several Bach preludes that have this, and certainly you can move throughout that. But for most of the dance movements, things like inventions, symphonias, fugues, all those kinds of things, you do want one mood and one tempo throughout. As I just mentioned, a lot of Baroque music is based on dance forms such as the minuet, the allemande, the gavotte, the gigue. Each of these has its own time signature. So for instance, the minuet is always in 3/4 and an assumed tempo range. This is because Baroque French court dance was the hot thing in the 17th and 18th centuries. If you were an aristocrat anywhere in Europe in the 1600s and early 1700s, you would know how to dance all of these dances because your court would have employed a French dance master. I think this is just hilarious. There was some statistic about the number of French court dance masters working in Leipzig during Bach's time there, and it was a really large number, like 30 of these guys working in this one little tiny town in Germany. So it was the hot thing. When you showed up at a party and the orchestra started playing, you needed to know, okay, that's an allemande, and this is how I do the steps for the allemande. All that to say, this is very far removed from our current culture. Nobody in the 21st century is dancing the minuet. So it's important for our students to have some idea of what this meant, to understand that men and women would have known all these steps. They would have worn shoes with heels on them. Everything has a lilt to it. It is an upward motion. And whatever you're playing, even if it's not specifically listed as a dance, should have a dance-like lilt. I find a lot of students playing a Baroque music feels very dead. It does not have this feel. So we're going to talk about some ways in all of my specific videos about how you can articulate. And I'll talk in a minute about what we can listen to help us kind of imbibe that sound and have that in our ears. But it's just very important to understand that everything in the Baroque is based on dance. Articulation is a vast topic that we can talk about in the Baroque period because, for the most part, composers did not write articulation markings in their music. So if you are looking at an urtext edition, there will be no slurs, no staccatos, no accents, nothing like that. So we're going to talk about articulation in a minute. I'm also going to ask the TMP staff to link an outside lecture that I have on this. If you really want to get nerdy about this, I have a much longer lecture that you can watch. Ornamentation is also the really big issue with Baroque music. There are so many trills and turns and mordents and inverted mordents and nachschlags and all of these things that are notated with these little squiggles. And so I would really recommend that if you are not comfortable with executing a lot of ornaments just based on what the composer would have written, that you make sure you are using excellent student editions that help you know how to realize these ornaments. And I have a table here that will go over a couple of them in just a second. But lastly, I just want to say that dynamics are not included in most Baroque scores. That's not to say that Bach didn't ever write a forte or a piano. He did. But almost all of our music is not going to have it. So if you're using an excellent teaching edition, they will give you suggestions on dynamics. But this is also a great opportunity for your students to be creative and decide how they want to put dynamics in their pieces. And so for each of the piece-by-piece videos, I'll give you some suggestions on that for specific pieces, and you can start to kind of pick up on how I like to think about that and decide that. So let's briefly go over Baroque articulation. I just have to couch this in articulation is an expressive choice. There's not a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. It's how you feel the piece should be articulated to get that mood or affect that you want it to have. And so that it sounds, like a minuet or like a gigue. I have several guidelines here. Again, these are in my longer lecture that I'll link here, and these will be on the PDF that you'll be able to look at later. I'm not going to go through them all, but I just wanted you to see that I do have rhyme or reason in how I choose to articulate and how I choose to teach my students to articulate. Things like leaps, intervals of more than a third, generally should be detached. And that if you detach before a syncopated note, then when you land on that syncopated note, it has a natural accent just from lifting and dropping into it. This is a table that I have gotten permission to use from a woman in Illinois named Karen Rogers, where she just goes over the most basic types of ornaments and how you would articulate them. Turns and mordents, I think, are quite easy if you know how to do them. Where we get into trouble is a trill or an inverted mordent. And I'm just going to throw out there that generally these should be started on the note above. So if you look at that top example on the slide, the printed note with the trill marking is a C, but the executed version of it starts on D, on the note above. Now, that being said, every single trill should be taken in context, and it depends on what you've done before and what you're going to after in how you're going to execute it. The other one that I want to highlight here is the appoggiatura, which is towards the bottom of this slide. An appoggiatura is not a grace note. It is a non-chord tone that is dissonant and should be leaned on. And I'll go over those anytime we have them in a piece-by-piece video. I'll go over them. But again, I have another video specifically on basic ornamentation. I will link that here as well, so that if you want to dive into this a little bit more, you can. I put a photograph here of a cathedral in Europe in the Baroque style, just so you can have a visual. And this one is really overwhelming. It's gorgeous, but it's just so much of just all of these teeny little decorations and gold filigree, and everything is filled in. This just speaks to the busyness that we oftentimes hear in Baroque music, the excessive ornamentation, right? And all those extra little filigrees and things that are there. And so if your students haven't seen anything like this before, just do a Google image search for Baroque architecture, and you'll find things like this. And it's very helpful for having that understanding of, oh, this is what was valued in this time period. This type of artwork of this excess was, what was the hot thing at the time. So to get that sound in our ears of what it actually might have sounded like, and to really be able to hear beautifully, expressively performed Baroque music, I would strongly suggest some of the things that I'm going to put here on this slide. The first, I got to admit, I'm totally obsessed with this YouTube channel. It's the Netherlands Bach Society, their YouTube channel. Their project is called All of Bach. They are literally on a mission to record everything that Bach wrote on period instruments, including harpsichords, of course. I find the harpsichord recordings fascinating, and their recordings of harpsichord music sound much better than everyone else that I've ever heard. So I do recommend, if you're looking for harpsichord recordings, go to their channel. But what I actually find the most helpful on their recordings is the articulation of the string playing, because I think that really helps us hear how we might articulate at the keyboard as well. They also perform in beautiful settings such as museums and churches, and they do have several videos where they're talking about the instruments that they're using or talking about how they approach a piece. So it's really a fascinating project and beautifully done. I also recommend the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment YouTube channel. They have some similar things where they explain instruments and things like that. I love John Elliott Gardner's recordings. There's not as much of his video recordings available, but he has loads and loads and loads of audio recordings, and they are excellent as well. And then if you are looking for Baroque music, specifically Bach, performed on the modern piano, I would recommend Andras Schiff, Angela Hewitt, and Murray Pariah. They are just my favorite for expressive Baroque music performance. And they all play it differently. So that just reminds us that it's not about doing it right. It's about making expressive choices and sharing the beauty of this time period in your playing. All right, so let's move on to classical era. This is the latter half of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. Of course, we think of Mozart, Haydn. Clementi wrote a lot for piano, so we have a lot of material for him. And then the early years of Beethoven's composition. I'm also going to put Beethoven on the Romantic one because, of course, he pushes us into the Romantic era as well. And his later compositions, especially his later piano sonatas, which we're not teaching to young children, those definitely are in a totally different style and not what I'm going to talk about within the classical era here. But again, we have all these lovely minor masters such as Kuhlau. Where would we be without Kuhlau sonatinas? Diabelli as well. And then, sons of J.S. Bach. and of course, many others. So let's work through some of the classical characteristics. We have a big shift. All that filigree, all those things in that photograph of that cathedral from the Baroque era, people decided it's too much. We need to move away from that, and the pendulum of style swung to the opposite direction. So we have homophonic texture. We have one melody with accompaniment, very different from our polyphonic texture. We have these broken chord accompaniments that include Alberti bass. Your students need to just know how to play Alberti bass and see, oh, that's my G major chord, and I'm going to do. That's my Alberti bass. So your students do need to know their chords when they're playing this time period, know the real basics of 1, 4, and 5 in these keys, and how the composer might have chosen to do that accompaniment, in what sort of style and pattern. The melodies contain easily defined singable phrases, whereas Baroque lines are complex and move all over the place. These are beautiful lines that you can get in your ear very quickly and remember. And so your student needs to shape them beautifully, right? Our students have to play these easily defined phrases very beautifully. Now, I just want to go back and say, we just have to shape our polyphonic Baroque lines beautifully too. It's just a different thing. It's helpful in these more, easily defined singable phrases to actually have your students sing, or if they play a wind instrument, play the melody on their flute or their clarinet and see how that feels, because that's what it would have been intended to sound like. Articulation is usually marked. Thank you. We don't have to decide it for ourselves. And as we move into the middle of this time period, whereas previously a more detached articulation would have been the default, now legato starts to become the default. So if you see a long left-hand line of, say, Alberti bass or broken octaves, that kind of thing, you can assume that generally your left hand can play that legato. It doesn't have to be super syrupy, but it's not going to be detached on each note. We have themes of contrasting mood or character. Again, this is in response to that Baroque idea that there should be one consistent character throughout the movement. Now we have differing themes. The best way, I think, to engage students on this is to tell them that, a lot of our piano music, especially things like sonatas, are based on the opera. Mozart is most well known for his operas. Those are his greatest legacy, I believe, to classical music. And whenever we're playing a sonata, we have the same idea of these different themes. There might be a beautiful princess or the lovely maiden. There might be the conquering hero. There's the bad guy, the villain. And you have the first theme and the second theme, and they are different characters, and they're oftentimes interrupted by somebody else. So it's really important to have your students imaginatively engage in that. Which character is this? And then make sure that they, play those themes in a different way, and we can hear the different characters coming out. Which, of course, I've already mentioned sonata allegro form. This was, whereas French court dance was the hot thing in the Baroque period, sonata allegro form is the hot thing now. And I always tell my students that composers were trained in how to write in this form. It's a very specific form about what key you begin in and what key you end the exposition in, and then what you can do in the development, and then what you have to do in the recapitulation. I always tell my students that I feel like composers who wrote sonatas were oftentimes thinking, okay, I'm going to follow the form, but how can I do it in the most creative way possible? And how can I, stay within the limits of what I'm expected to do and yet be as creative as possible? And then, of course, all the greatest composers break the rules. There's several times where Beethoven does not follow, in his sonatinas especially, he doesn't do the recap exactly the right way. Things like that. So it's fun to look for when the composer has broken the rules, when they've really expanded it out or made it really interesting, all those kinds of things. But it is important that as soon as your students start playing sonatinas, that they know the very basics of sonata form, and that know it. I'm just going to admit that when I finished my undergraduate degree, I was not entirely confident in analyzing sonata form. And what made me very confident at doing this was teaching hundreds of sonatinas. And now it's just second nature. Oh, yep, there's the first theme, there's the second theme, there's our transition. Now we're in the development, all that kind of thing. So I'll help you on this on each of the piece by piece videos. But it is important to train our students in this because it is the basis of what we do in this time frame. I also want to say that I heard somewhere that sonata allegro form is really based on the general archetype of a theatrical story or the narrative that you might experience in a novel. So it's helpful to think of the exposition as the time when we are introduced to all of the characters. Development is when all the drama happens and the conflict occurs, and then the bad guy is slain. And then the recapitulation is the resolution of that story. We see the characters again in their rightfully resolved states. So anyway, if that's helpful for you for thinking through this and making that come alive for your students, then I would offer that and get your students thinking about how this relates to their favorite movies or books or imaginative stories, fairy tales, all those kinds of things. I do want to throw out, though, that even though I said French court dance has moved out of popularity, the minuet is still fashionable at this time. And then we start to also get country dances and German dances and Ländler. So there still are dance forms, especially at that earlier intermediate level. We have a lot of these binary dances, like the Haydn German dances, the Beethoven German dances, the Mozart minuets. So it is still important to understand how to create that dance-like lilt, but it's just not as big of a thing, and it has changed a little bit from the Baroque period. So here's my visual example for you of I believe this is a museum in Portugal, maybe. I didn't write down what this was, but the classical architecture style. So we have, if you think back to that picture of that Baroque cathedral and, all the things that were going on, and now we have these clean, balanced lines. There is still decoration, but it is in moderation. And we have a lot of vertical and horizontal lines that create this beautiful, balanced image. And of course, this is hearkening back to the true classical times of Greek and Roman classics, such as things like the Parthenon and the Colosseum. And they were looking back to that. And that's actually why this is called the classical era. But it's also I feel like, in response to what just came before. We're done with all of that. We are moving on to a cleaner, more organized time. So for classical suggested listening, I would encourage you to look up some of these. Some of these are the same as what we saw before. I've still got John Elliott Gardner on here. His Mozart recordings are of orchestral music are phenomenal. I love, again, the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, and they, like I said, have that educational YouTube channel. I love Sir Neville Mariner's recordings with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields. For those of you who live near London, I'm sure you've been there. It is one of the most beautiful places. I love that church. Very fun to go in and think about recordings made there. I would recommend Haydn sonatas recorded by Svatoslav Richter. He's very fun to listen to. And maybe not your first thought on classical era playing. And then I'm very particular about my Mozart listening. So these are just three. I'm sure you can have other choices and people that you love listening to play Mozart, but I would strongly recommend Mitsuko Uchida, Alicia de la Rocha, and then Murray Pariah has recorded the complete Mozart Concerti. So if you're looking for recordings of those, it's great to look those up. Of course, there are numerous other performers that you can enjoy their Mozart playing. These are just a few examples of really clean, scintillating, and expressive Mozart playing, in my opinion. You're, of course, entitled to your own. All right, so now we move into the 19th century and Romantic era. This is the golden age of the piano. And so for many pianists, this is our favorite time period because it really is the time when the piano comes into its own. We have the full range of the keyboard, lots of use of the damper pedal. We're going to get into all that. And I could barely fit on enough composers. I tried to include a few women on here and composers of color. But, of course, the canon of what we assume are the important composers include a lot of these, German white guys. So here they are. Beethoven moves us into this time period. Franz Schubert is also at the beginning of the Romantic era. Some people like to classify him as classical. I prefer to classify him as Romantic. And then we have all these wonderful people who wrote for the piano. Some of these are minor masters such as Stephen Heller and Cornelius Gurlitt. And I would strongly recommend that you check out their intermediate repertoire because it's just much better for students than a lot of the easy Beethoven or easy Chopin. There are examples of those pieces, and we're going to include those in our piece by piece series. But it's just important to recognize that sometimes the composers who spent more time teaching, such as those that I mentioned, like Heller and Gurlitt, they oftentimes, and Bergmüller. Where's Bergmüller? Did I leave him off? Oh, Bergmüller. Those guys are the ones who write the best in that Romantic style for students.
Well, I'm sorry to cut Janna short, but we only have time for a limited look into this fantastic workshop, and I'm sure you'll agree just how detailed Janna is, the knowledge she has, and the amazing presenter that she is. If you'd like to listen to the rest of this workshop, it's another 30 minutes or so. Indeed, you can get access to the full PowerPoint presentation and watch the video with timestamps. Then come over and join us inside Top Music Pro membership. In our studio membership, we've got workshops from Lisa Donovan-Lucas, who teaches songwriting. We've got Sight Reading Secrets with Rebecca Stewart. Garrick Olson shares tips on the Chopin Ballade No. 1. Leon Fleischer teaches a Pathetique Sonata, and so many more. And these are just our workshops. Of course, we also have almost 40 different courses as well from all the different topics, teaching beginners to teaching teenagers to the 12-bar blues, preparing students for jazz band, and then all of our great business topics, including website building, marketing, and studio organization. Find out more and sign up today over at topmusicpro.com. Well, that's the end of the show for this week. Next week, we're going to be talking about how you can use Facebook groups for marketing to students, but also for building your own studio community. There's some great tactics and tricks about how to make this work. So even if you've tried this before and have not really seen the success you wanted, then make sure you tune in next week. I've got a special guest presenter who's an expert in this area coming to share all his strategies. Until then, I'm Tim Topham, and you've been listening to the Topcast. I'll speak to you again next week. For more information about this episode and to find out how to enhance your own teaching, visit topmusic.co. You'll find everything you need for your studio, from lesson plans to cheat sheets, quick win teaching ideas, and guides on how to build your teaching business. Plus, you'll be connected to a global community of the world's top music teachers. And when you're ready, join hundreds of other teachers around the world by becoming a Top Music Pro member and get access to all our bonus content and flagship courses. And don't forget to follow topmusic.co on social media and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. That's all for today. We'll see you in the studio.